Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is Carrie Getz. Welcome to another edition of this podcast series, Careers for Women Trades and Vets in Tech and Data Centers. And it goes with the book. So hopefully this gives you some insight. Today, for new insight, we have Kayla Bix here from Bluebird Network. So Kayla, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you guys do?
Hi there, I'm Kayla Bix. I'm 26 years old and I work for Bluebird Network. We are a Midwest communications infrastructure provider. So that means we do the typical data center co-location solutions, but we also service our own customers with our own fiber optic internet services. So that's pretty unique.
Very cool. So you have your own exchange. And then what do you do at Bluebird?
So I personally am an outside plant engineer. So that means I am the one designing to get the fiber into the ground physically. So I do all of the blueprinting and things for that type of side of it. I don't necessarily do the network side, but I am how it gets in the ground and how we actually service our customers end to end.
Talk a little bit about what it takes to get it to be an outside plant engineer. Did you go through regular Bixie training? Did you study it in school? How did you get where you are?
So I went to school for engineering management, so that's pretty broad. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, so I kind of got every discipline under my belt. But out of school, a telecommunications job just kind of fell into my lap, and it was with another company locally. We did a lot of the same things, like outside plant, the network side, and that's how I ended up at Bluebird. But the outside plant portion is when you go to a customer, they're like, hey, I live at XYZ, my company's XYZ. So I just need to know how we get from where our current facilities are to this customer. And then I will go through and I'll walk the whole route outside physically. I'll make sure we aren't going to be hitting any other telecommunications or water lines. I do a lot of the actual drafting of the project.
So that's pretty interesting. And I think it's a little different approach than some of the other ones that we've talked about on the podcast. Tell everybody how you decided to go into engineering management. Because normally engineering jobs don't really fall on young girls' radar as far as jobs to look. So what led you down that pathway into engineering management?
Yeah, I've always been on the more technical side of things. I loved math, I loved science. It was one of those typical like girls in STEM kind of things, in school. So I really ran with it. So when I went to school, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do because there are so many different, like very niche markets in everything. So I wanted to see if I could find anything that I was interested in. So I went with the more broad engineering management. That way I could kind of dabble in everything and choose from there.
The STEM programs that you took in school, clearly they were pretty good, right? Because they led you down that path to that career. But as you started going through some of the STEM programs, what were the things that just really excited you? I mean, you could have gone 100 ways in science, you could have gone 100 different ways in math, you could have been a doctor, you could have been, statistician, a lot of things. But what pulled you into the engineering side specifically?
I've always loved the idea of building things hands-on. I was always super crafty as a kid with like popsicle sticks and glue and string. So I always liked those silly little projects in STEM, architecture, that side of things.
Very nice. And the nice thing is, at least with your job, you get to get outside some. It's a lot better than a lot
Yeah.
of engineering where you're stuck in a desk all day.
Yes, except like today when it's raining outside. So I'm happy to be talking to you instead of out there.
There you go. There you go. Well, I'm glad I could save you from a bad rainy day. That's my community service for this
Yeah.
Thursday that we're recording this. Talk a little bit about outside plant and what that entails. And I think this is an important subject because we have all of these efforts going on right now with broadband initiatives to make sure that we have broadband everywhere. And clearly all of that is going to sit on a fiber backbone. or at least a fiber backhaul. There's no part of even wireless communication that doesn't have that fiber component, which I think a lot of people don't realize. They assume if it's wireless, it's a wireless everywhere. But talk about some of the planning considerations. If somebody's thinking about putting fiber in the ground, what does that entail? What are some of the things that you look for from an obstruction standpoint? How do you figure out what's below the ground? What do you do to figure out current fiber pathways? Some of those kind of things that are involved in your job.
Yeah, so clearly we mainly need customer income to build these routes to them. But when that is happening along certain routes, I will be cognizant of what's also in the area. If other customers will want to build on it, so that way we could put a bigger fiber in the ground so we can service more customers without having to like upgrade fiber in the future. So we do a lot of pre-planning for things like that, customer growth. We have quite a few areas that you can tell, like we'll go through building plans for the future. We work with the city a lot to make sure that we're up to date on like new subdivisions going up or shopping communities that we could possibly service in the future. So we're always looking forward so we can make sure that we're ready to service anyone that needs it.
I think that's important from an infrastructure perspective for sure. New cities, even new subdivisions that are planning fiber to the home, they're putting in those fiber assets to start with to make sure that all of that's going to be available to new residents. And you bring up a good point about customer money building this. And we talk about this in the book in site selection, that two things you absolutely have to have at a site for a data center are fiber and power, and whatever means of power you're going to use. But fiber is critical. And one of the things we talk about is even if the fiber's not there, you can get it there. But sometimes those construction costs are hefty, hefty, hefty.
Yes.
And the fact that you can doesn't mean that you can afford to, right? So talk about some of those justifications and how you work with customers, and what sets that tone. What makes a customer decide that they want to build in a space and bring the fiber to them as opposed to go someplace where the fiber already exists?
Yeah, so in a lot of the areas we're in right now in the Midwest, they don't have any other fiber option. So it is very like paving the way for that. And we make sure that we're very competitive on our side on pricing, like their costs in the future, their initial upfront cost. So we're very cognizant of that. But also when we are working these customer builds, if we already have a contractor in the ground in a conduit or what have you, we will use that time to also work on capital projects. So we'll put a bigger fiber in that's not specifically for this customer, but we could use it in the future.
And that's that dark strand that we also talk about. It's significantly less expensive to pull a bunch of strands at once than it is to pull a couple strands several times, right?
Yes.
Because of the labor component and the dig and all that disruption of things. But you do bring up another good point, and that is the work that you guys do with the city to see what's coming up and what's on the horizon and becoming an active part of that planning. Talk a little bit about kind of what that process is. How often do you meet with the city? How does that work from your perspective as you guys fill out your planning? Do you do this 6 months at a time? Do you do a 3-year plan? Do you do a 10-year plan? How does that process work?
The planning is really, we don't have a set plan, but we go through like different cities have town halls often. So we will go to those, we will get their insight on what they plan to do in the next 3, 6, 12 months. And we'll kind of take that into consideration. I mean, we don't always like make a plan of action off things that they say, but we do always keep it on the back burner, like just in case. And then another good example would be we had a build that we were working on in the Missouri area, and we didn't realize that there was going to be a road expansion. So our plans had our fiber going where we thought was going to be the correct right of way. But we ended up getting city input saying that there was going to be a road expansion and roundabouts being added and a whole new highway section. So I'm glad that we caught that because then we could plan accordingly. So when they do the road move, we don't have to also move our facilities.
That brings up a really good point too, because all this stuff sits under the ground, and you have to protect your investment and make sure that people call before they dig and all that, which we all know not everybody does.
Not everyone
That is
does.
important. Call before you dig, especially now because a lot of the power lines are going into the ground too, and you definitely don't want to drive a shovel into one of those. That would change your day. But the same thing happens for fiber. Communications is so critically they're so critical, I mean, to different enterprises that fiber has to stay up and running because that's a critical part of the uptime. And as you plan these fiber routes, how do you guys work that out so you have redundant paths and different ways to get to different office buildings, for instance, or different data centers? Do you always plan dual routes? Do you plan single routes and then it's just another pass in if somebody pays for that second way around? Or do you try to always accommodate those? How do you sort that out?
So mainly if a customer wants a diverse path, that's what we'll call it. That's what we call it here at Bluebird. We will get two separate fiber lines, and those will go to the pop of that location in different directions. So if there's a cut on the east end, then we can keep them running with the west end route. But if a customer doesn't have a diverse path, we do have a very good like emergency maintenance team that if there is a fiber cut, we will go out and we'll get a new fiber spliced and any customers will be up and running in a matter of 90 minutes. So we're always ready for a cut to happen and if that were the case.
Hopefully
But yeah,
not,
not
but
everyone, yeah, not every customer gets a diverse path, but like hospitals, banks, things like that, that it's very critical. They will usually get their own diverse path through us. But if that's not the case, I mean, don't worry, we have ways that we can get things back up and running.
and what would you say for the typical person that runs the fiber on the road? Clearly, that's a skilled trade, and we need way more of these in this industry and around this industry. We need more people to take up the trades. But where do you guys find technicians? What's the process for onboarding some of those people for people that might be interested in those jobs? Because right now, with all these broadband initiatives, it's about to explode, I think.
Yeah, so Bluebird Network, we actually go through contracting companies all over the Midwest to physically put our fiber in the ground. We have in-house techs that go out and like shoot our OTDR shots to make sure that our light is getting from end to end. But we personally don't have construction crews for that.
So, if people are interested in that side, there are particular companies that do outside plant construction, or you'll see OSP for outside plant, typically in their name or at least in some part of what they do in their brochures. And those are definitely great paying jobs, and they can take you all over. People need
Yes.
fiber outside of your city limits too. So if you like to travel, you like to be outdoors, you like a decent job where you work, kind of 8 to 5, and you're not stuck in too much of the craziness after hours. Those are, I think, great paying jobs.
Yeah, we love our contractors so much. I mean, they are contractors through us, but we use them day after day, job after job. So,
And I think people don't realize how important those business relationships are in this industry. And certainly, I'm sure every industry, but particularly in mission critical, you really want vendors that are going to be your business partners, not just be somebody that, hawks you parts or works project to project. Because once you get that working relationship, it's so much easier to deal with, what if there's a problem? What if there's supply chain issues? And maybe you want to touch on supply chain issues. Is that something that's affected you guys like everybody else?
not particularly that I have noticed. I mean, we definitely have like bulk fiber reel costs have increased, but we found ways to make that not necessarily hit the customer cost. So,
Oh, well, that's good. I think a lot of people, a lot of companies anyway, over the last couple years have had to sort out alternate paths and different ways to do that. Well, let's jump a little bit and talk about what it's like to be young in this industry. Are you the youngest one at your company?
Yes, I am for sure. I would say by at least 20, 25 years.
And so I'm a boomer. Happy to be a boomer because not being a boomer would be a bad thing at my age, right? But so talk about some of the differences. What are some things for other young people that are going to, starting out in work and professional careers? It is different. It's different from starting out in school. And certainly when you go to work with people that were raised under a different era and taught a very different way. How have you bridged some of those hurdles and what's worked really well for you?
Yeah, so I mean, it definitely is interesting. When I first got here, it was not only being young, but being a female. That was, it was very eye-opening to say the least. But the people I work with specifically, we are in a tech we are in a tech field. So that is helpful. Like they understand all of the computer things. So it's not like that kind of age gap bridge that we have to deal with. But I would say you can definitely tell when someone is like set in their ways in a company or they have this certain idea of how things should go. And if someone like myself who sees things from a totally different perspective were to have a different insight, I was a bit timid to voice my opinion on things, but I learned that I can, even if it's scary, I should try and give my opinion or do something if I know it's what's best for the company or it could be good for my growth in the long run.
And that's really huge. And you bring up such a great point because I think that a lot of women starting in the industry, especially because it's male dominated, they are timid to speak out at the table. Or if they say something and it gets rephrased and then it's accepted by somebody else, not to say, hey, didn't I just say that?
Yeah.
And I think realistically, none of that is intentional. I mean, we all know that there's bad actors, right? But I don't think there's a million bad actors. I think people do things with the sincerest of intentions and they don't try to hurt anybody's feelings. But I do think that we have kind of a responsibility and an onus on ourselves to take that chip off our shoulder and just kind of go with the flow sometimes and realize there was no intent there, so don't necessarily be upset about that, which I think is a little different from probably my generation to some of the younger generations because you guys are you were brought up with digital devices in your hand telling you everything that should be wrong and how you should feel and what you should think and swiping through anything that you don't agree with. So everything in your frame of reference is something you agree with. And that makes it very difficult when you get in a business setting and people have different ideas. And trying to work through that diversity of thought gets, for a lot of young people, very challenging because they're not used to not seeing things they don't agree with. And so maybe talk a little bit about some of your experiences there. When you did start speaking up, what was the reception like for what you had to say? Did people laugh at you? Did they embrace what you had to say? And talk about how that environment kind of brought you out of your shell and helped you deal with some of those culturally different issues.
Yeah, I would say it was a very open experience when I had voiced my opinion or given something that I would think is a better direction than the way we were going. It was definitely, it was approached with, they were accepting and they would listen, but they would always like push back a little bit. Because I mean, it's kind of the same thing the other way. Like they're very set in these ways. They've been as in this industry for so long. They like it's worked for them up until this point, so why change it? So I think the back and forth was definitely healthy and good for, I mean, the discussion, and then we would
And
just
the
go
company
from
as a
there.
whole. Yeah. I
Mhm.
mean, honestly, when you bring people together that have very, very different backgrounds, right? And it doesn't have to be anything to do with race, sex, gender, any of that. We're all, I mean, even two people of any demographic are very, very different people. So if you take the identity stuff out and just talk about the learning process that happens, right? All of that pushback you learned from, correct?
Correct.
And you might not agree with it, but you still learn. You learn the company ways. I mean, all of that is really kind of an apprenticeship a little bit into how the company works, how things happen, because that's stuff you weren't taught in school. I mean, you didn't know when you got out of college how that company was going to work.
No way. I mean, that's totally right.
And I think those conversations are really important, even though some people find them very uncomfortable. It's hard, to hear somebody give you constructive criticism, and hopefully it's constructive. If it's not, you're not in the right place.
Yeah.
For sure. Because, all of these conversations should happen with mutual respect, I think. And again, back to that intent, if people aren't trying to be ugly, don't. I mean, we all have bad moments. We all say stupid things. Nobody's perfect there, including myself. So, but I do think that those dialogues are important. And if you had to mark where you were when you started and where you are now, as far as knowledge and what you go, talk a little bit about what that difference is in your life going through this learning experience.
Yeah, so I've been with Bluebird now for 3 years. So that's quite a while. I mean, in terms of my professional career as a whole.
Most of it,
So,
yeah.
so I mean, it's been amazing. I've learned so much. I mean, telecommunications is so niche as it is. There's always something to learn. It's always changing. So that's exciting for me. But yeah, I've learned so much. I've definitely learned more of like my quote unquote learning style, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah, I take in information a lot differently now than I did when I started because that's also from adapting to the ways that, I mean, the teachers, quote unquote, that are teaching me things, my peers, my bosses, things like that. They have a different way of going through their things. So that's how I can adapt to learn those.
So what's maybe the biggest or the most rewarding lesson that you've learned through all of this?
I would say it's that I've always been a perfectionist. Personally, I've tried to be a perfectionist. It hasn't always worked out that way. But when I first got here, I was scared to be wrong. So I just wouldn't try to be right. If I knew there was a chance that I wouldn't be 100% correct, I would just not try. So I've definitely learned that I need to not be afraid of failing, and that makes me learn a lot quicker. I get to where I want to be faster, and I'm just more confident in myself, knowing that I might not know something now, but if I stumble there, I'll get there.
And that's so important. I mean, this industry as a whole, I've said this 100 times, is probably the largest ongoing apprenticeship ever because technology happens so fast and things happen so fast. There's no way that curriculum keeps up with it. And so much of this industry is knowledge transfer from one person to another. I certainly would not be anywhere that I am without asking a whole lot of questions. And I think that's hard for people, especially young people starting out in their first job or their first big career, to really get comfortable asking questions. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is the company expects you to do that. I mean, that's how they gauge what you know and how they can fix your training. So if you don't ask questions, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot.
Yes. I mean, there definitely is that fine line of I don't want to feel like they think I don't know what I'm doing. But yeah, once I got over that and that they were there to help me because I'm ultimately here to help them, that was really comforting for me. So that was a big hurdle that I overcame.
Yeah, and that's I think such great advice for people coming into the industry or even, starting a new job, starting to do anything. It's just don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah.
Most bosses actually will judge you harshly if you don't, and they'll judge you more harshly, I mean, if you don't than if you do, right? Because they expect that. It shows initiative really when you ask those questions. It's viewed as a positive. So we're bumping up close to our time here. If you wanted to leave people with some parting words of wisdom, insight, what would you say on the way out?
I mean, I've already kind of touched on it, but don't be afraid to be wrong. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. Even like personally, sometimes I'll say it, I feel stupid sometimes, but I feel like I have to feel that way so I can learn what I need to know and get to where I want to be going.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Well, I want to thank you, Kayla, so much for your time. For all of you listening, we hope you check out the book that goes with these podcasts and continue to listen to some of these people, these great experts, and what they do in their jobs so you can learn from them. Kayla, thanks again. We wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much.